to this session on Literary Criticism and Theory Part 2, Core Course for 3rd Semester MA English. Now, in this session, first we'll have a brief outline of contemporary literary theories, and this session is purely based on your syllabus, and I have tried to brief it as possible as I could. So let's begin. Now, first we'll go through some important terms in this paper. First one is structuralism. Now, structuralism emerged in the 1950s and it extended to the 1960s. Now, this theory attempts to identify the underlying structures that make experience possible. So, like the term suggests, structuralism attempts to identify the underlying structures. It gives importance to the structures that make experience possible. Now, structuralism analyzes structures of language, the psyche, or the society that operate unconsciously. So, through structuralism, we are trying to analyze structures of language, which you might have learned in linguistics, then the psyche or the society that operate unconsciously. Thereby, it analyzes how meaning is produced. So, the crux of structuralism is that it analyzes how meaning is produced, how we produce meaning. That is what we analyze basically through structuralism. Now, in structuralism, the reader acts as the agent of meaning because he undertakes the task of deciphering the codes that generate meaning. Now, deciphering means we can say that unmoulding, or we are trying to understand which code generate particular meaning. So here the reader acts as the agent of meaning because he undertakes the task of deciphering, uncoding the codes that generate meaning. Now, a group of French thinkers under the influence of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of language applied concepts from structural linguistics to the study of social and cultural phenomena. So, you can say that, or you can see that in structuralism there is the influence of Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure and mainly his theory of language, which is applied from structural linguistics to the study of social and cultural phenomena. So, in short, we can say that the origin of structuralism is in linguistics. Now, the principles of structural linguistics were applied by Claude Lévi-Strauss to anthropology, then Roman Jakobson, Roland Barthes, and Gerard Genet to literary and cultural studies, Jacques Lacan to psychoanalysis, Michel Foucault to intellectual history, and Louis Althusser to Marxist theory. So, various theorists applied structural linguistics to anthropology, then to literary and cultural studies, psychoanalysis, intellectual history, Marxist theory, and so on. Now, the structuralist influenced theory in England and the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, respectively. So, this is a short idea about what is structuralism. And in studies related to literature, structuralism tries to explain how works have meaning and the effect of those meanings, but does not give importance to new interpretations of work. So here, in literature, structuralism explains how works can have meaning and the effect of those meaning, but it does not give importance to new interpretations of works. That is, it does not give a new layer of interpretation. Now, the main effort is to provide new ideas about literature and frame one signifying practice among several others. So, the main effort of structuralism is to provide new ideas about literature and frame one signifying practice among several others. Hence, it launched the way to symptomatic or suggestive readings of work of literature and initiated cultural studies to try to open up or discover the signifying procedure of diverse cultural practice. So, uh, actually, we can say that structuralism launched suggestive reading of works of literature, and it initiated cultural studies, which tried to open up or discover the signifying procedures of diverse or different cultural practices. So, this is all about structuralism. Next, let's see what is post-structuralism. Now, post-structuralism is regarded both as the condemnation and continuation of structuralism. So, it is like the opposite or the continuation and the continuation of structuralism. And it follows some of the principles of structuralism, but at the same time questions some methods and assumptions of structuralism itself. So, that's why we say that it is regarded both as the condemnation and continuation of structuralism. That is, it follows some principles of structuralism, but at the same time it questions some methods and assumptions put forward by structuralists. They try to explain how theories get enmeshed in the phenomena they try to elaborate, and how texts generate meaning by disrupting any conventions that structural analysis identify. So here, post-structuralism tries to explain, or they are trying to elaborate and explain how texts generate meaning. That is, how texts are generating meaning by going against the conventions that structural analysis identifies. Now, the thinkers point out that it is impossible to describe a whole or coherent signifying system because systems always change. So, the thinkers under post-structuralism believe that it's impossible to describe a whole or coherent signifying system. Why? Because systems always change. Now, post-structuralism critiques knowledge, totality, and the subject and considers them problematic. So, according to post-structuralists, knowledge, totality, and the subjects are critiqued, and also they consider them as problematic. Now, as objects of knowledge, structures of systems of signification are dependent on the subject. At the same time, they are structures for subject that are in the grip of forces that create them. So, Derrida, who is associated with post-structuralism, makes no distinction between philosophy and literature. Um, According to him, all disciplines employ language. All language shares the quality of being indeterminate. That is, indeterminate means it's not uh, constant, it keeps on changing. So, Derrida is one of the theorists associated with post-structuralism, and he makes no distinction between philosophy and literature. So, you should understand one thing, that structuralism uh, originated in linguistics, where the belief is in objective knowledge, whereas post-structuralism originated in philosophy, and they are skepticism, that is, they generate skepticism about objectivity. So here we can see that Derrida questions both logocentrism and phonocentrism. He holds that there is no reliable or intimate relationship between words and things, or knowledge and reality. Now, you know that logocentrism means, that logocentrism is from the word logos in Greek. It means word, speech, or reason. It's a term which can connote law or truth. And Derrida sees Western culture as inherently logocentric, that is, it revolves around a central set of truth, and which are purported by the universal principles. Whereas in phonocentrism, it's not the same. And what we find here is that post-structuralism tends to be emotive, urgent, euphoric, and construction of reality is continuing yet postponed processes. But whereas in structuralism, as I said earlier, it originated in linguistics, tends towards abstractions, generalizations. And according to structuralism, reality is constructed through language. So that is how both structuralism and post-structuralism is working. Next is deconstruction. Now, deconstruction means actually it is a method of reading text in order to subvert or undermine the coherence and unity of the text. Okay, and this is done by foregrounding the conflicting forces within the text that serve to dissipate the seeming definiteness of its structure. So they work by foregrounding the conflicting forces within the text, and this is how it works basically on the structure of a work. Okay, now post-structuralism also describes the philosophy of deconstruction and contribution of Jacques Derrida, and offers to comment critically on the notion of structure as propounded by structuralism. So in deconstruction also you could see the influence of post-structuralism and also structuralism. Now, deconstruction, like I said, is a strategy that evaluates the hierarchies in the binary oppositions in Western thought, namely speech, writing, presence, absence. So, binary oppositions means the speech, the opposite of speech is writing, presence is absence, nature is culture, mind is body, form, meaning, and others. So, deconstruction is a strategy that evaluates. It is a strategy which evaluates the hierarchies in the binary oppositions in Western thought. Now, to deconstruct a binary opposition is to expose that the construction is produced by a particular discourse and that the binary does not have a natural relationship. So, how do we consider binary opposite things? This is like we are trying to expose the construction is produced by a particular discourse, and it does not, we are trying to establish that the binary does not have a natural relationship. And the aim of this deconstruction is not to destroy the binary but to undo it and to reassign it a new structure and mode of functioning. So by deconstruction, what we are doing is we are not trying to destroy the meaning or the structure, nothing, but we are trying to undo it, and we are trying to reassign a new structure and a mode of functioning. Now, this essentially involves a new practice of reading the text, where the text is shown to read against itself. So, through deconstruction, we are trying to involve a new practice of reading the text, where the text is shown to read against itself. Now, the text is multiple and disunited with shifts and breaks, contradictions, silences, aphorias. Aphorias means gaps or blind spots, and fault lines means cracks that expose any earlier activity and movement. So, what you find is the text is having multiple meaning or multiple layer, and it is disunited with shifts and breaks. Contradictions can be seen there. Silences can be seen. Then aphorias. Aphorias means gaps or blind spot, and fault lines means crack that expose any earlier activity and movement. So we are trying to bring up a new practice of reading the text, and we are trying to read the text against itself, and we are trying to reassign it a new structure and a mode of function. So we are deconstructing it. Okay, so this is what we do in deconstruction. Next important term is psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis is the systematic analysis of the unconscious mind. Now, Freud claims that creative writing is the product of the unconscious, and psychoanalysis aims to unearth this operative process. Now, what is psychoanalysis? It is the systematic analysis of the unconscious mind, and according to Sigmund Freud, through psychoanalysis, or he claims that by creative writing, or the creative writing is the product of the unconscious, and through psychoanalysis we are trying to unearth how this works, how this process is taking place. Now, the unconscious desires and drives in the author's unconscious mind are embedded in the literary work, and the psychoanalytic reading explains this process by identifying the hidden linguistic and symbolic patterns. So we can say that psychoanalysis is a literary criticism, or psychoanalytic literary criticism is influenced by the tradition of psychoanalysis, which was begun by Sigmund Freud. And here he tries to involve psychoanalytic reading of the other or a character. And um, what we are trying to do is that how the author's unconscious mind is working and how he is writing his particular work, literary work, and this through psychoanalytic reading, we are trying to explain the process by identifying the hidden linguistic. That which means every author does not write it in the same way. Each authors are having their own way of using language, their own way of using images, their own way of using symbolic patterns, etc. So through psychoanalytic reading, we are trying to unearth this operative process. And there is another theorist like Carl Jung. His collective unconscious explores the relationship between the literary work and the unconscious, which he claims is formed with racial memory. So Carl Jung's concept is known as collective unconscious, and through that he explores the relationship between the literary work and the unconscious, and he believes that this unconsciousness or unconscious state is formed with racial memory. Okay, with his racial memory, Lacan states that the unconscious is structured like a language. So Lacan is of the opinion, Lacan is another theorist, he is of the opinion that the unconscious is structured like a language. Now, psychoanalysis plays a definitive role in trying to understand the condition of a patient that happens through reconstructing or replaying a critical moment or event from the past. So you might have seen in films where the hero or heroine in critical situation is undergoing what to say undergoing a particular treatment where he is hypnotized or she is hypnotized. Why we do that? In order to understand why there is a bipolar character in a particular character or the protagonist of a film or a story. So through hypnotism we try to unearth what is his past or what is her past, and which event hurt them, or which event influenced them, or which event is, or through which event that particular person ended up being in a disturbed state. So all these are done in order to understand the real condition of a patient, if it is a patient, or if it is a psycho, if a person is a psycho. We do all these things. So this is what is the purpose of psychoanalysis. So it plays a definitive role in trying to understand the condition of a patient or a character in a film or a protagonist in a book or whatever it is, and that happens through reconstructing or replaying a critical moment or event from the past. So in some movies you find that the hypnotizer tries to recreate the situation which has had a deep impact on a person's character. So that's how they unearth what is actually happening to that person. So this is what we do through psychoanalysis. I'm just giving you an example. This is just an example for you to understand this concept easily. Next is feminist theory. Feminist theorists demand equal rights for women and encourage a gynocentric discourse. So here, like the term states, that through feminist theories, what we demand equal rights for women, and we encourage a gynocentric discourse, that is women-centric discourse. While feminism embarks on dissolving the gender binary man and woman, it also unearths a history of women's writing. So through feminism, they are trying to dissolve the gender binary, that is man-woman. Instead of that, they are trying to demand or to get equal rights for both men and women, and also they unearth the history of women's writing. That is, without the influence of men, they need to bring a history of their own, where they talk about their experience, their thought process, etc., through their language or their talent. While British and American feminisms have delved into women's consciousness, they have been criticized for neglecting other feminisms and the related issues of caste, race, and ethnicity. So, if you're taking British and American feminisms, they have delved deep into women's consciousness. So, they have been criticized for neglecting other feminisms which are related to the issues of caste, race, and ethnicity, etc. You might have heard of Dalit feminism, black feminism, etc. Okay, so they are criticized for rejecting those concepts related to caste, race, and ethnicity. Now, feminism rejects patriarchal discourses, and psychoanalytic feminists reject the implicit sexist foundation and articulation of psychoanalysis. So, in feminism, what you find is they reject patriarchal discourses, and psychoanalytic feminists reject the implicit sexist foundations and articulations of psychoanalysis. So, they don't want to be seen as second sex, instead, they want to be seen equal to men. So, that's what feminism is doing. The range of issues that feminism discusses is evidence of its relationship with masculinity and cure and sexuality studies apart from the social, economic, and political bearings. So, beyond political, social, and economic bearings, they try to discuss range of issues which are related to masculinity, cure, and sexuality studies as well. Next is new historicism and cultural materialism. Now, new historicism is a concept which was there in uh, America. Then cultural materialism was practiced in Britain. Both these concepts are almost same because their holistic approach to literature is to integrate literary and historical study. Now, in new historicism or cultural materialism, um, the, this is a theoretical engagement with studies related to history branch out into cultural materialism in Britain and new historicism in America simultaneously during the 1980s and 1990s. So, this is a theoretical engagement with studies where they are trying to relate literature with history, and they branch out into two: new historicism in America and cultural materialism in Britain. But their idea is the same, and both came up during 1980s and 1990s. Now, the historical formation of the subject and the debatable role of literature during the Renaissance period is important for cultural materialism. So, for cultural materialism, they gave importance for the historical formation of the subject and the debatable role of literature during the Renaissance period. And new historicism traces the interconnections made among texts, discourses, power, and foundation of subjectivity in Renaissance. So, this is how they differ. So, in cultural materialism, what you find is the historical formation of the subject and debatable role of literature during the Renaissance period, and that is important for cultural materialism. Whereas new historicism traces the interconnections made among texts, discourses, power, and foundation of subjectivity in the Renaissance. So, this is how they differ. Now, Stephen Greenblatt, Louis Montrose, and others emphasize how Renaissance literary texts are placed among the discursive practices and the institutions of the times, and consider literature not as the outcome of a social reality but as one of diverse hostile or opposed practices. So, Stephen Greenblatt, Montrose, and others, they emphasizes how Renaissance literary texts are placed among the discursive practices, and that is how they are trying to bring a new reading of Renaissance literary text. Okay, and also they consider literature not as the outcome of a social reality but as one of diverse, hostile, or opposed practices. New historicism offers a critique of religious and political ideologies of the period and decipher the extent to which the discursive practice in literature, with its apparent subversiveness, functions to limit subversive energies. So, what you find is new historicism critique religious and political ideologies of the period and decipher the extent to which the discursive practice in literature, with its apparent subversiveness, functions to limit subversive energies. Next important term is post-colonial theory. The earlier and continuing European imperialist strategies and their consequences are thoroughly analyzed by post-colonial theory. Now, from this term itself, it's very clear that in post-colonial theory or through post-colonial theory, we are trying to analyze the earlier and continuing European imperialist strategies and their consequences as well. Now, the idea of an independent nation, culture, and practices that reinforce, question, or analyze dominant notions of national consciousness, conquest, identity, ambivalence, resistance, hybrid subjects, the other, and subaltern are directly addressed. So, in post-colonial theory, we are trying to analyze, or we are trying to find out the idea of an independent nation, culture, and practices, and that reinforce or question or analyze dominant notions of national consciousness, like what is national consciousness, what is conquest, and what is identity or identity crisis, what is ambivalence, and what is the resistance. Resistance may be shown by the colonized, okay, against the colonizer. Then hybrid subjects, the concept of the other and subaltern. These are the various themes or various ideas discussed under post-colonial theory. Then conflicting languages and cultures, nativity, and the notion of the empire writing back are frames of reference to probe the construction of culture and knowledge from the intellectuals from post-colonial societies and write back their unwritten, forgotten, and distorted histories. So, by what we find in post-colonial theory or post-colonial writings is that you find conflicting languages and cultures, the notion of nativity, the notion of the empire writing back or empire writing back, and these are the frames of references to probe the construction of culture and knowledge from intellectuals from post-colonial societies. They write back their unwritten, forgotten, or distorted histories. Usually, the colonizers have written a distorted version of histories, but the colonized people, or through post-colonial writing or theory, the suffering people, or the suppressed people, or the oppressed people, or the colonized ones, they write back their unwritten, forgotten, or distorted histories. So this is all about post-colonial theory. Next is eco-criticism. Now, eco-criticism is shifting from anthrocentric discussions to geocentric representations. Eco-criticism or green studies, these locates the interconnectedness among literature, nature, and the environment. So it's very clear from the term itself. From man-centric discussions, we turn to earth-centric representations or ecological related issues or criticism or green studies, and we are trying to locate the interconnectedness or mutual connection between or among literature, nature, and the environment. Nature has a natural bearing upon the attitudes and behavior of human beings, and the affective psychology is reassessed. So, we are trying to address the natural bearing upon the attitudes and behaviors of human beings, and the affective psychology is reassessed by studying eco-criticism. Then destruction of the environment, environmental crisis, masculinist orientations, and feminist notions of equating domination and control find representations in literature. So the notion of why are we destroying nature or the environment, and the result of destruction of the environment, what are the various environmental crises, masculinist orientations, and feminist notion, that is eco-feminism. All these concepts come under eco-criticism. Animal studies is in particular centers on domination and exploitation of animal animals, and the resolve of eco-critical studies is to foster and enhance a positive outlook on human nature-animal interaction. So the main idea of eco-critical studies is to foster and enhance a positive outlook on human nature-animal interaction. So what we should understand is that there is a symbiotic relationship between man and nature and animals. So we cannot live happily by destroying nature or by disturbing animals. So altogether we all form the ecological connection or link or chain. That's what we are trying to learn. That is, nature is equally important like our lives. So this is what is the notion of eco-criticism. Now, so far we just went through the various terminologies that come under each module. Now, next let's see the first module, Structuralism and Overview. Now, we had a very short idea about structuralism in the beginning. Like I said, it origins in linguistics. The belief is in objective knowledge. They tend towards abstractions, generalizations, and reality is constructed through language. So this is all about structuralism, and roots of structuralism lies in the theories of early 20th century Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and so this is what, and you all know that it began in France during the 1950s, and first we see structuralism in the works of Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes. Their essential belief is that things cannot be understood in isolation. Context of larger structures are, they are important. So this is what the crux or the essential belief of structuralism. That is, things cannot be understood in isolation. Context of larger structures are important. So context of larger structures do not exist by themselves. These are formed by our way of perceiving the world. That is, meaning is attributed through structuralism. Okay. Now, there are certain terms to be understood while you are going through structuralism. The first one is structure. Now, what is structure? Structure means a set of interrelations between invisible underlying principles and the visible form of the principles within a system. So, invisible and visible form of principles. So there is a set of interrelations between visible underlying principles and invisible underlying principles within a system, and that is known as structure. The underlying principles, which are invisible, organize the structure into a concrete form and control its functioning. So the structure actually does what? They organize the invisible. The underlying principles, which are invisible, they are organized with the structure and into a concrete form, means a strong form, and control its functioning. A structure works as a unit. So the structure works as a unit. Structuralism suggests that every system has two levels, surface structure and deep structure. So there are two kinds of structures in structuralism or in anything. That is, one is surface structure and the other one is deep structure. Now, surface structure is physical and observable in human activities, behaviors, and objects, which means it is visible. Surface structure is visible, it is physical and observable in human activities, behaviors, and objects. Now, deep structure is abstract and invisible. It is a set of principles that lies below the surface structure. So, now you join two stones with the help of cement. Cement, when you apply cement and you join two stones, there is a binding relationship between the stones, and the cement is acting as a deep structure. That is the binding force between these two stones. Similarly, I just said an example. So deep structure is abstract, it is invisible, it is a set of principles that lies below the surface structure. The words of a language form the surface structure, and the use of these words in particular situations and in specific patterns represent the deep structure. Now, for example, when you say that, for example, if you are talking about sea, SEAC. Now, the surface structure sea means it is a body of water, but if you're using it in a literature, for example, you might have learned Riders to the Sea, a play written by Sinjay. Now, here, when you're analyzing the meaning of sea, you understand that it is the giver and taker of life. That is, sea provides food for the people in the island, and also sea is the destroyer there. So that is the deep structure, because we are using it in a particular situation, and you find a deep meaning for that. So that is deep structure. Whereas when you're talking about sea, it is just a body of water. So that is the surface structure, means that is just the surface level of the physical meaning. And then if you're going to a deeper level into the meaning of that particular word in a particular situation, then you get altogether a different pattern or different representation, and that is denoted by deep structure. Hope it is clear. Now, a structure is a conceptual, theoretical, or abstract framework that organizes and understands physical entities. So, a structure is a conceptual framework. It organizes and understands physical entities. Now, as a conceptual system, a structure has three features. Now, there are three features for a structure. They are wholeness, means a system functions as a unit; transformation, a system is dynamic; and self-regulation, transformation does not exist beyond the system, means it is controlled. Okay. Then structuralism comprises two components. One is structure, and then the other one is ism. Where structure refers to the essential constituent or parts of an entity, a system or a principle is formed when the suffix ism is attached to the entity. Now, structuralism means it is a component. Structuralism consists of two important components. One is structure and ism. Structure refers to the essential in parts or constituents or elements of an entity. Then ism means it is a system or a principle. That is, this structure becomes a principle or a system when the suffix ism is attached to the entity. So, structuralism is a system composed of essential constituents and describes a structure that is complete entity. So, here the structuralism is described as a structure which is a complete entity, means which is complete. So that's what we say. A structure has three features. One is wholeness, that is completeness. Then there is transformation, and then there is self-regulation. Structuralism attempts to analyze the nature of structure and the general laws that govern it. Okay. Now, Sushu's principles of structuralism. As you all know, it is an intellectual movement in Europe in the early half of the 20th century. That is, it was Sushu's structuralism is an intellectual movement in Europe in the early half of the 20th century. It originated from the radical ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist, semiotician, and philosopher. His ideas laid the foundation for many significant developments in both linguistics and semiotics in the 20th century, and that's why he is known as father of modern linguistics. And his pioneering work, Course in General Linguistics, which was published in 1916, is a compilation of his lectures after his death by his students. Then, language can be studied historically, that is, its development can be traced through several phases and the transformations can be analyzed. Now, traditional scholars compare old and new forms of words in a language and try to discover rules that make such change possible. So, Saussure rejects this traditional approach, which he labels diachronic. So, Saussure rejects the traditional approach of making comparison between old and new forms of words in a language, and he labels it as diachronic. So, what Saussure tries to say through his work is that language can be studied historically and its development can be traced through several phases and the transformation can be analyzed, and he rejects the traditional approach of the scholars where they compare old and new forms of words in a language try to discover rules that make such change possible, and he labels this as diachronic. He adopts an approach that studies how language works at a particular period of time rather than observe changes that have occurred, and he calls this approach synchronic. Synchronic means when you're studying a language how a language works at a particular period of time, that is known as synchronic. And diachronic means when you are studying a language in a historical way. Now, the synchronic approach pays more attention to discovering the deep structure that helps a language to function instead of the individual history of words. So, synchronic approach gives more importance to discovering the deep structure that helps a language to function at that point of time instead of the individual history of the word. And he coins two terms, langue, French, it is a French term which means speech, and parole, which means speaking language. And so langue is a speech and parole is speaking language to elaborate the deep and surface structure respectively. Now, langue is a set of underlying principles or rules that govern the working of language or any other system, and parole is the specific use or utterance in language. So, parole is a specific use or utterance in a language. Langue means it is a set of underlying principles or rules that govern the working of a language. Maybe rather it is more formal. Okay, and langue means speech, parole means speaking language. He defines language as a system of signs where the sign is the basic linguistic unit, and the sign comprises of two aspects, signifier and signified. So Shu defines signifier as a sound image and signified as the concept. Now, for example, the signified means the concept. For example, when you are taking the pen. Now, pen, this sound image, pen, you get an image in your mind, and that is known as signifier. And signified means the concept, that is, you show an image and you give it the label pen, and that concept is signified. Now, word is signifier, that is PEN is signifier, and meaning is signified. But they depend on each other and work in association, and this association between them is called signification. Now, the word pen is associated with an image, that is, that the thing which we use for writing. Now, this word, that is signifier, and meaning, that is signified, they depend on each other and they work in association, and that association between them is called signification. So Shu formulates two cardinal or important principles of science, that is arbitrariness and difference. He argues that the relation between words and their meaning is arbitrary, which means one word may refer to many objects, an object could be referred to many words. Means, for example, the signifier play could refer to a sporting match, a recreational activity, a theatrical production, or the act of performing on a musical instrument. So the word play does not mean that you play football. You enacting a drama is also known as, or act of performing is also known as play. So the word play is not fixed with any of these objects, and no object can make it meaningful unless it is placed in relation with other words, that is signs or in context. So that's why it is called arbitrary. Sign is not meaningful in itself. It has to relate itself with every other sign to make sense. So a sign should have an association with a signifier or signified, then only it will give meaning, or it will have a meaning. And this relation between signs is based on the notion of difference. This means that each sign in a linguistic system is meaningful because it is different from other signs. Signs are meaningful because they convey meaning by being different from another. Now, the human mind recognizes differences that are opposite, and they are known as binary opposition. So, you know that pen is different from, chair. So, both the images which comes in our mind is different, and also that is sit or stand. So, human mind can easily recognize differences that are opposite, and that is known as binary opposition. Binary means dual or two or involving pairs. So a binary opposition would refer to a pair in which the two terms are in a state of opposition. For example, black, white, black and white, big, small, tall, short, etc. Now, therefore, white is not black, tall is not short. All these are binary opposition. Now, structuralism argues that human language and discourse can be understood as structured in terms of binary opposition. Now, for political reasons, these opposition always function as a hierarchy where the first term is privileged over the second. Hence, dichotomies such as white, black, man, woman, subject, object, nature, culture, God, man, speech, writing, presence, absence, all these are important for literary criticism. Now, Saussure introduces the term value, which is the relation between one sign and the other. A sign has no absolute value if it is not part of its system. The relation of one sign with other signs gives its value. And Saussure uses another term, signification, with value. Signification is the relation between the two components of the sign, that is signifier and signified. So the relation between signifier and signified is known as signification. Value means the relation between one sign and the other. Okay, so this is all about Saussure's principle of structuralism. Now let's see what is structuralism and literature. Critics like Jonathan Culler, Gerard Genet, Zvetan Todorov, and Robert Scholes have applied structuralism to literary text. Now, in his book Structuralist Poetics, Structuralism, Linguistics, and the Study of Literature, Jonathan Culler provides two reasons for adopting the method of linguistics for the analysis of social and cultural phenomena. Now, what are the two reasons? One is social and cultural phenomena are also signs of a different signifying system, just as words are signs of linguistic system. Now, just as words are the signs of linguistic system, social and cultural phenomena are also signs. This is one of his arguments. And the second one is cultural and social phenomena do not have essence like linguistic signs, but they are defined by a network of relations. So you can talk about cultural and social phenomena as they are defined by a network of relations, though they do not have a sense like linguistic signs. Now, a literary text may be identified as a parole and the entire system of literature as slang. So, if you're taking a literary text, it could be considered as an individual work, and that is parole, individuality. Then, entire system of literature as a lang, because there will be rules and regulations for that. Now, the critic would place a particular text in the literary system where it actually belongs and where it can become meaningful. Such a study includes both abstraction and comparison. Now, literature is regarded to be an objective system, and a literary text is an essential component or part of the system. So, literature should be considered, or it is regarded as an objective system. A literary text is an essential component or part of the system, that is literature. Now, structuralism and Russian formalism. The Russian formalist critics give importance to the formal or structural aspect of literature, that is form. Form is an integral part of a literary work that organizes it into a coherent structure and imparts meaning to it. So, Russian formalists give importance to form, which is an important part of literary work, and it is the form that organizes a particular work into a coherent, meaningful structure and imparts meaning to it. The content or subject matter is ignored by them because they believe that form directs the content. So they believe in form, and they believe that if form is correct or appropriate, content will fall in place. They fail to explain two aspects: the unity and oneness of content and form in literary text, and the relation between one literary text and the other. These are not explained by them properly. Structuralism explains both these aspects. So, structuralism explains the unity and oneness of content and form in literary text. Now, first, structuralism studies a literary work as a whole, which means the relation between the whole and its part. Second, it examines a literary text as a structure and compares it with other structures. So, This is how structuralism studies a literary work. Now, Roman Jacobson disapproves of Saussure's division of synchronic and diachronic study of language, although he is influenced by Saussure's view. Jacobson proposes that language could be studied structurally across time, which for Claude Lévi-Strauss and Jacques Lacan is important. So, Roman Jacobson is against, or he disapproves of Saussure's division of synchronic and diachronic study of language. Instead, he says that language could be studied structurally across time. Okay, and this is the base for Claude Lévi-Strauss and Jacques Lacan in their work. Then, now structural anthropology. Structuralism in cultural anthropology analyzes culture that are viewed as systems in terms of structural relation among their elements, because all cultures are structurally similar. So, if you are analyzing culture, what you find is all cultures are structurally similar. Initiated by the French cultural anthropologist and ethnologist, that is, a person who studies different societies and cultures, Claude Lévi-Strauss, in the early 1950s, the principles of structuralism are used to organize some characteristic features of human life, irrespective of diverse cultural practices. So instead of using the characteristic features of human life, instead of using the diverse cultural practices, Claude Lévi-Strauss uses some characteristic features of human life in order to study culture, and that's why it is called structural anthropology or cultural anthropologist. That's why he is known as like that. Now, Lévi-Strauss regards the Mendel structure alone to be the structure he could work on, because the universal patterns within system of cultures are products of the structure of human mind. So he says that learning the structure of human mind is more important, and he finds in his extensive analysis of kinship patterns in mythology, art, religion, ritual, and culinary traditions, all these things. So he says that almost all cultures are structurally similar, and he regards the Mendel structure alone to be the structure he could work on, because the universal pattern within systems of cultures are the product of the structures of the human mind. And he finds in his extensive analysis of kinship patterns in mythology, art, religion, ritual, and culinary traditions, food traditions. He worked on the concept of Langen-Perrol in his search for the fundamental structures of human mind in Structuralist Anthropology, which was published in 1958. He considers culture in all its aspects as a language. He says that culture in all its aspects is a language. He believes that myths of all cultures and human thought across cultures share similar underlying structures because they are governed by universal law. So, most of the myths in a culture are same everywhere, be it Western culture or Eastern culture or whatever. That is common universal thoughts are same, because all the myths of all cultures and human thoughts across culture share similar underlying structure, and they are governed by universal laws. For example, the myths of different cultures could be condensed to a set of relations called themes, which are the central units of myth. For example, journey, the myth of death, birth, sea, death, truth. All these are common in every culture. Myths should be read in relation to another, not in isolated context. So myths should be read in relation to one another, not in isolated context. Myths are a certain kind of language that can be divided into small units called mythemes. Mythemes helps to understand several myths in the world, and if myths are regarded as form of narrative, mythemes are narrative structure. So mythemes are narrative structures and myths are regarded as forms of narrative. In The Savage Mind, which was published in 1962, Lévi-Strauss compares the bricklayer and the engineer and concludes that savage mind has a similar structure as the civilized mind, and human nature is the same everywhere. So savage mind or the traditional mind or the nomadic mind, they have similar structure of the civilized people or mind, and human structure or human nature is the same everywhere. Hegel's proposition that every situation has two opposing forces and their solution is found in the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis impressed him. So, this is what is all about structural anthropology. Now, next is narratology. The term narratology, which is taken from the French narratology, was coined by Zvetan Todorov in Grammaire du Decameron, which was published in 1969, which means the science of narrative. So, the term narratology was coined by Zvetan Todorov and it means the science of narratives. A.G. Grimmer's model of narrative analysis, Gerard Genet's model of narrative and discourse analysis, Zvetan Todorov's project of grammar narrative deal with literary text, and they form an independent type of literary structuralism known as narratology. So, independent type of literary structure is known as narratology. It is the science of narratives. A narrative is usually a story in prose or verse that includes characters, events, actions, and dialogue. So, narrative means it is a story in prose or verse form, a poetry form, and that includes characters, events, actions, and dialogue. A narrative communicates certain events through the experience of the characters. So, most of the time they talk about events or story through the experience of the characters in a narrative. Narratology focuses on the structure of narration rather than the content of the narrative. While the study of the content is the study of the subject matter, the study of the structure of narration studies the mode of narration. The difference lies in what subject matter is told and how the manner it is told. So the difference lies in what that is how the subject matter is told, that is the manner, and what that is subject matter is told. Now, narratology studies how a story is told and tries to find out an inclusive model of narration that can incorporate all the possible ways of storytelling. So, this is all about narratology. Now, structuralist narratology. Gerard Genet proposes a model where there are three levels of narrative discourse. One, the story, that is known as history, which is narrated, the narrative itself, that is recit, and the way the narrative is narrated, narration. So these are the three levels of narrative discourse. One is story, then the narrative itself, and the way the narrative is narrated, that is narration. Now these levels interact with each other so that the narrative can progress. So history, recit, and narration are the three levels of narrative discourse. Their interaction is based on three aspects: tense, mood, and voice. Tense means it is the arrangement of events in the narrative that work within the framework of order, duration, and time. Mood means it creates the atmosphere of the narrative, which depends on distance and perspective, and that is mood of the narrative, whether it is happy or sad or funny or whatever it is. Then voice refers to the voice of the narrator. Voice helps understand the narrator's relationship to the story being narrated and the way it is being told. Then Genet's model indicates that free combinations of levels and categories reveal the underlying principle on which a narrative operates. He believes that the study of narrative is primarily the study of the relationship of narrative and story, narrative and narrating, and story and narrating taken individually. So there is a relationship between the study of narrative and the story or narrating, whatever it is. Next is semiotics, the study of signs and symbols which convey spoken or unspoken ideas or details and generate meaning as part of signification. That is, signifier and signified is called semiotics. Semiotics is the form of intertextuality, puns, metaphors, and reference to cultural commodities make up written and spoken languages. There is symbolic representation. Now, the common example of signs used worldwide are traffic signs, emojis, logos of corporates, etc. are known as semiotics. Symbolic representation. Semiotics is a key study into the evolution of human consciousness. Okay. Then, Saussure and semiology. Saussure uses the term semiology to describe the study of signs and Charles Sanders Peirce calls it semiotics. Okay, and then uh, Saussure observes language as a sign system, and his fundamental semiotic concept is distinction between the two components of a sign. The signifier means a set of speech sounds or words, and the signified the concept of or idea behind the sign. Saussure differentiates parole, that is actual individual utterance, from lang, the underlying system of convention that makes such utterances clear, that is rules or principles. Signifier in Saussure's concept are related to their object of reference in three modes. One, a symbol related to its reference only by convention, for example, traffic signal. An icon similar to its reference, that is sign on the road for men working, onomatopoeic words, that is, and an index directly associated with its reference. Smoke is a sign of fire. Okay. So this is how signifier works according to Saussure's concept. Then semioticians suggest that the sign can never have a definite meaning, for the meaning must be continuously qualified. Signs are made of signifier, that is word or sound, and the signified, that is object, and the relation between the two can be arbitrary, means symbolic, imitative, that is iconic, and direct, that is index. Semiosis is the process of interaction between the signifier, signified, and the idea or sign that is produced in the mind when the word is heard or read. So semiosis means it is the process of interaction between the signifier, signified, and the idea or sign that is produced in the mind when the word is heard or read. Now, Charles Sanders Peirce and semiotics. Contemporary semiotics is the contribution of the American philosopher and logician Charles Sanders Peirce, who prefers to use the term semiotics, which is important for media studies, film studies, and cultural studies, apart from literary criticism. The diverse elements of a text are not only related to each other, but also to the social system. Structuralist semiotics uses semiotic theories of sign to read narrative. Peirce's conception of semiotics is triadic, that is in three ways. Representation, that is the form of the sign, for instance, a word, a gesture, or writing. Interpretant, that is idea that is generated in the mind upon reading the sign. That is when you read the word pen, any idea is generated in your mind. An object to whom or what the sign refers are also called referent, that is the pen, that is the image. All three constitute the sign, and interaction between the three is semiosis. The interaction between the three brings about language. Now, Julia Kristeva and poetic language. Julia Kristeva, during the early stages of her work on poetic language, mentioned that pleasure motivated the subject to enter language. She categorizes signification into two. One, the semiotic. It is labeled as chora. It is the association of the mother, body, and the pre-linguistic, the material for poetic language, foundation of language called genotext. Then the symbolic means syntax, grammar, and the expression of linguistic act. The language is used to communicate is called phenotext. Okay, genotext means foundation of language called genotext, and phenotext means language used to communicate is called phenotext. Semioticians take interest in the underlying system, and this interest in the structure behind the use of specific sign links semiotics with the method of structuralism that analyzes such relations. Saussure's theory have influenced structuralism, structural linguistics, and post-structuralism. The principles of semiotics are applied to a variety of fields, including aesthetics, study of beauty, then anthropology, study of human beings, psychoanalysis, communication, and semantics, that include the work of the French scholars Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, Julia Kristeva, and Umberto Eco. Now let's get into the essay, The Structuralist Activity. Now, The Structuralist Activity is an essay written by Roland Barthes. Among literary critics, perhaps the most prominent and prodigious name to be identified with both structuralism and post-structuralism is Roland Barthes. So Roland Barthes is a most prominent and prodigious name to be identified in both with both structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, the structuralist activity represents an early phase of Barthes' work in which he sets forth certain structuralist principles. In this essay, his idea sounds like structuralist, and in the death of the author, he seems post-structuralist. So, in the structuralist activity, he sounds like a structuralist, and in the death of the author, he seems like a post-structuralist. Now, structuralism concerns with meaning but not absolute meaning. Rather, it is process of obtaining meaning. How we get meaning is more important than what the meaning is. In other words, deep structure is more important than surface structure, and it focuses on underlying pattern of meaning. So, structuralism is concerned with meaning but not absolute meaning. In this, deep structure is more important than surface structure. Then, structuralism believes in linguistic system, condition of meaning, and binary opposition. As a structuralist, his emphasis is on creative or reconstructive activity, endlessly productive of meaning, though meaning itself as a substance is less important than the activity of producing it. So here emphasis is given for meaning. Structuralism believes in linguistic system, the state of meaning, and binary opposition. Now, the goal of all structuralist activity is to reconstruct an object in such a way as to manifest thereby the rule of functioning, that is, the functions of this object. And the reconstruction is called simulacrum. Now, the goal of all structuralist activity is to reconstruct an object in such a way as to manifest thereby the rules of functioning or the functions of a particular object. And that reconstruction is known as simulacrum. The simulacrum is intellect added to object. The simulacrum is essentially the representation the critic makes of the sensuous manifold which is the object. Now, structuralism involves two operations. One is dissection, that is finding in it, the simulacrum, certain mobile fragments whose differential situations engenders a certain meaning. And articulation means discovering or establishing for the units posited by the above activity, means dissection, certain rules of association. So dissection and articulation. Dissection means we are trying to fragment the whose differential situation creates problem for a certain meaning, etc. And articulation means discovering or establishing for the units posited by the above activity. Above activity means dissection, certain rules of association. Now, ultimately, one might say that the object of structuralism is not man endowed with meaning, but man fabricating meaning. And it is this meaning-making activity which is the structuralist and human activity. Form maintains the contiguity of units from appearing as a pure effect of chance, and the work of art is what man rests from chance. A work of art fails to mean or signify something if the reader fails to see form in it. So without form, there is no work of art. The simulacrum thus constructed does not depict the world as it has found it. It manifests a new category of the object, which is neither the real nor the rational but the functional. So simulacrum constructs does not depict the world as it has found it. Instead, it manifests a new category of the object, and which is neither real nor rational but functional. Simulacrum highlights the strict processes used by men to assign meaning to things. The world has always been looking for the meaning of what is given in it and what it produces. However, what is new here is a mode of thought or poetics that does not allocate complete meaning to objects it discovers, but tries to find how the meaning is generated, at what cost, and by what means. So, what the writer is trying to say is that through simulacrum, we try to find what is new, and we try to find a new mode of thought or poetic, which does not allocate complete meaning to object it discovers, but tries to find out how the meaning is generated, at what cost, and by what means. A thing is intelligible only if it is structured. However, the object of structuralism as a science, just as it is a mode of thinking, is not the object of fabrication, but man himself, not man endowed with meaning, but man engaged in the activity of fabricating or structural meanings, man as homo significans. It could be concluded that the object of structuralism is not man bestowed with meaning, but man fabricating meaning, the homo significans. So homo significans means the object of structuralism is not man bestowed with meaning, but man fabricating meaning, man who creates meaning. So with that, we come to the end of the first module, structuralism, and the essay, the Structuralist Activity. Now the second module is Post-Structuralism or Deconstruction, an overview. Now in this module, we'll just go through the important concepts and some theorists, and then we'll go through the essay. Now Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, was primarily concerned with hierarchical construction of knowledge by Western philosophers, beginning from Plato and extending up to Saussure. Edmund Husserl's proposition that a geometer as an individual could propose the objective law of geometry through language became the central argument in Derrida's work, Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry and Introduction. Now, Derrida argued that language is neither objective nor impersonal, and hence its use to state objective and impersonal law is problematic. So, Derrida does not see language as objective or personal, neither objective nor impersonal. His three fundamental works, Speech and Phenomena of Grammatology and Writing and Difference, all published in 1967, explicate his theory of deconstruction. And now, before getting into post-structuralism, it's just important to recapitulate the principles of structuralism, and it is also important to understand deconstruction. Now, structuralism is grammatical in approach because it tries to analyze the codes or rules in cultural practices that form a system and attempts to decipher the message to be conveyed. Scientific and objective in aim, it sets out to find out the structure of a system in literature and helps understand its meaning. So, structure is given importance. Now, language comprises our consciousness, our self, and our world. Language creates experiences. Language arises out of the inherent stable structure of the human mind. Structuralism refers to mental concept and not object. Language is a system of signs which operates through the dual process of relation and difference. Structuralism works on the principle of difference of one sign from the other and relates signifier to signified, but sees this relationship in an arbitrary way. Now, Claude Lewis and his study of myth. Lévi-Strauss is able to upgrade his approach to structuralism with a study of myth. He mentions that myth attains meaning from the way they combine and not from their inherent value. So, therefore, myth represent the mind that creates them and not some external reality. So, myth represents the mind that creates them and not some external reality. Myths are eternal because they refuse to accept history. The several version of a myth cannot be considered fabrication of some truth, genuine version, but as essential part of the structure of myth. So, a several version of myths are not, or it should not be considered as fabrication of some truth, but as genuine version. Conversely, different versions are part of the same myth only because a myth is not reducible to a single uniform content, but it is a dynamics. It has a dynamic structure and it is universal. And this means that all the versions of a myth have to be taken into consideration so that its structure can be evident. Now, myth originates from the asymmetry between belief and reality, freedom and necessity, identity and difference, and so on. Lévi-Strauss says that from the viewpoint of language, myth is language functioning on an especially high level. If lang, the synchronic element of language, is associated with reversible time and parole with diachronic, the historical aspect, then myth constitute a third level of language. So if lang is the synchronic element of language and is associated with reversible time, and parole with diachronic, the historical aspect, then myth constitute a third level of language. So myth is the unattainable synthesis between the diachronic and synchronic aspects of language. So myth becomes the third dimension of language, where there is a continuous effort to reconcile the irreconcilable aspect of the other two dimensions of language, that is lang and parole. Now, since the complete reconciliation of these two dimensions is not possible, myth grows, and hence structurally the symmetry which gives it life cannot be resolved. So, since the complete reconciliation of these two dimensions is not possible, myth grows, and structurally the asymmetry which gives it life cannot be resolved. So that's all about structuralism and its connection with myth. Now, before understanding post-structuralism, it's very important to have a look into structuralism. Now, post-structuralism is the confluence of theories about language and its relationship with psychology, sociology, philosophy, and literature. Linguistic and textual in orientation, it challenges the earlier theories, exposes the inconsistencies in their propositions, and disrupts established notions. So it condemns established notion. It neither claims to be new theory nor proposes one, but interrogates the efficacy of earlier theories or the functionality of earlier theories, especially structuralism with respect to language. While post-structuralism accepts the structuralist notion of language as a system of science and its function of signification, it redefines the concept of science, reconsiders the relation between language and reality, and rejects the idea of a determinable meaning. Post-structuralism includes the theory of psychoanalysis proposed by Jacques Lacan, archaeological and geological theory of Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes' semiology, and deconstruction theory of Jacques Derrida. Derrida's theory of deconstruction, outlined in his papers Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of Human Science, and presented at the International Colloquium in October 1966 at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland, is the foundation and starting point of post-structuralism. So Derrida is the starting point of post-structuralism. Then Derrida exposes inadequacies in structuralism and expresses the need to reconsider its doctrines. Structuralist notions of a stable center and binary opposition in hierarchy are questioned, and a new method of analysis called deconstruction is framed. Now, Derrida also includes linguistic study of philosophical text and that constructs of language. Critics such as Paul Deman, James Hills Miller, Jeffrey Hartman, Harold Bloom, Barbara Johnson, known as the Yale critics, apply Derrida's idea to literary text. So who are the Yale critics? The critics like Paul Deman, J.H. Miller, then Jeffrey Hartman, Harold Bloom, and Barbara Johnson. And they apply Derrida's idea to literary text. Now, the contribution of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who began his career in psychopathology, later became a lecturer in philosophy and psychology. He turned towards history and engaged with archaeology and moved on to genealogy. And that marked his transition from the structuralist perspective to the post-structuralist one. And his ideas are the outcome of living in post-war France, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, which witnessed the emergence of existential phenomenology and Marxism as the two principal intellectual guiding principles. His important works like Mental Illness and Psychology, it's related to mental illness, human behavior, and personality. And his important works include Madness and Civilization, which was published in 1961, Archaeology of Knowledge in 1969, Discipline and Punish 1975, and The History of Sexuality 1976. Foucault's works are set against a backdrop where There are widespread resentment against America's neo-imperial policy overseas, discontentment against racist factions in Europe and America's intrusion into Vietnam. And most of his works reflect his radical view on thinking and behavioral changes that question power and structures. And more explicit his disagreement with Marxism as the framework to explore the social structure in France, where a reconceptualization of thought related to power would be the most appropriate stand. He disagrees with Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of existentialism, which relates personal experiences and sense of responsibility in a rather meaningless world. Existence is the essence of life. That's what he proposes the philosophy of concept to object to Sartre's philosophy of consciousness. Sartre is engaged with the analysis of meaning, and Foucault focuses on the analysis of a system. So Foucault focuses on the analysis of system, and Sartre is engaged with the analysis of meaning. He establishes and elaborates archaeology of the human science, and it is the study of the form of knowledge, mechanisms that categorize knowledge, and rules that help formulate knowledge gathered and documented and circulated. He believes that in every field of knowledge, the thinking process rests on certain underlying structures, and his concern is to uncover them. The structure shapes up and regulate knowledge that is gathered, the material collected, and the way it is imparted. Now, during the structuralist phase of his career, he associated with Roland Barthes, Derrida, Althusser, and Julia Kristeva, among others, and together they became part of the Tel Quel group. Now, what is Tel Quel group? Tel Quel, a journal that was published between 1960 and 70. It concentrated on structuralist and post-structuralist notion of language and writing that opposed capitalist values of consumption and stable meaning, and they celebrated plurality of expression. Foucault notices breaks in thinking patterns and discontinues or conjures that occur at specific historical moments. An episteme is therefore the underground grid or network which allows thought to organize itself. So episteme means it is the underground grid or network which allows thought to organize itself. Now, each historical period has its own episteme that limits the totality of experience and truth and governs every contribution to science in the period. Science becomes normal when scientists agree that their work has identified and solved scientific problems. This agreed upon achievement model is called paradigm or an exemplar. Now, language for Foucault is not the sovereign means to organize or represent knowledge. It is an object of knowledge to be investigated, just as living things, wealth, value, or history are investigated. So, language for Foucault is not a sovereign means to organize or represent knowledge, and language is an object of knowledge to be investigated, just as living things, wealth, value, or history, etc. Then Marxist ideology focuses on the clash between bourgeois tendencies and the working class, and psychoanalytic theories concentrate on the notion of the fractured self. Okay. Then Foucault developed a way of explaining and interpreting events without referring to the individual or subject. He analyzes that discourses which operate under a unique system of rules that are not under the control of human beings. So this observation marks his break from the notion of a stabler center. So he analyzes that discourse operates under a unique system of rules and that are not under the control of human beings. Now, what is archaeology? Archaeology analyzes the unconscious rules of formation that regulate the emergence of discourses of human science. Genealogy reveals the condition under which the human sciences exist and how they are intimately linked with particular technologies of power that are evident in social practices. Now, Foucault engaged in a genealogical study of discourses that map their initial stages and their formulations. Genealogy is the tracking down of discourses and institutions that have created notions of sexuality, sickness, criminality, morality, madness, or improvement, and reveals the disputable and contradictory powers that have formulated these conceptual opinions and standards. Now, what is Yale School or American Deconstruction? In the 1970s, critics such as Paul D. Mann, J.H. Miller, then Jeffrey Hartman and Harold Bloom of the Department of English at Yale University in America, they embraced principles of Derrida in their attempt to do away with new criticism, myth criticism of Northrop Frye, Hegelian Marxism of Lucas, phenomenology of Paulet, and French structuralism that gained ground in the early and mid-20th century. Now, in 1986, Derrida joined the University of California. He was associated as a visiting professor with several universities in America and Europe. Paul D. Mann was interested in analyzing the conflict operating between codes or rules of language and rhetoric within text. He finds an impasse where there is the assertion and simultaneous negation of opposing systems of logic or rhetoric, and his interest in the performative function of language influenced the speech act theory of John Austin. So, Paul D. Mann's interest in the performative function of language influenced the speech act theory of John Austin. Blindness and Insight Essays in the Rhetoric of Contemporary Criticism, which was published in 1971, centers on the paradox that critics achieve insight through a certain blindness. He notices that critics seem to adopt a method that is apparently different from what they intend to say, especially the American new critics. So, new method was adopted. In Allegories of Reading, which was published in 1979, he engages in tropes or figures of speech that destabilize logic and deny the possibility of a literal or referential use of language. Now, for D. Mann, reading is always a misreading because tropes continually interfere between critical and literary text. So, though text of several disciplines employ metaphors, the visibility of irony and ambiguity is obvious in literature. So, visibility of irony and ambiguity is obvious in literature. Now, J.H. Miller, he is known for applying deconstruction to fiction, especially in Fiction and Reputation, seven English novels, which was published in 1982. And J.H. Miller believes that fiction abounds in repetition and difference. His analysis of Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens explores how a single figure that occurs in a text expresses itself differently. Now, his intention is to show how presence is based on difference and repetition. He considers science as a rhetorical figure and language fictive. He shows how a reader moves from one figure to another and engages in a ceaseless lateral dance and considers repetition and difference are favorite figures in fiction. So, what are the favorite figures in fiction? Repetition and repetition and difference. So, those are the intentions to show how presence is based on difference and repetition, and favorite figures in fiction are repetition and difference. In Ariadne's thread, Case Studies in the Therapeutic Relationship, which was published in 2013, Miller uses the tropes of lines whereby the narrative is read line by line, and these lines trace genealogies in the text and progresses towards a series of deconstructive reading. And Miller shows how a literary text is a play of contradictory meaning and asserts that the text is indeterminable and undecidable, and therefore all reading is essentially misreading. So J.H. Miller says that all reading is essentially misreading, and he also says that the purposeful act of misreading gives them the space to convey their own genuine inspiration. So the purposeful act of misreading gives them space to convey their own genuine inspiration. Next is Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom combines his theory of tropes with the psychology of fraud and Jewish mysticism. He is known for the coinage mispresent, a misreading of the past masters to produce a new interpretation. So misreading of the past masters to produce new interpretation is known as mispresent, and this is a term coined by Harold Bloom. English poets after Milton are aware that they have arrived late in poetic history after many poetical fathers experience a kind of Oedipal hatred of their father and want to deny their paternity. They fear that their poetic fathers have exhausted all inspiration left and their poems should be seen as written against the poetic father, which is mispresent. So it's like a kind of Oedipal hatred of their fathers, because English poets after Milton find that they have arrived late in poetic history after many poetical fathers, and so they feel a kind of Oedipal hatred of their father and they want to deny their paternity. And they also fear that their poetic fathers have exhausted all inspiration left and their poems should be seen as written against the poetic father, which is mispresent. Bloom's psych-poetics has three stages. One is limitation, taking a new look; substitution, replacing one form with another; and representation, restoring meaning. The poet passes through these three stages when he tries to write something against the earlier poet. So this is what Bloom's psychic poetics talk about. There are three stages. One is limitation, taking a new look; substitution, replacing one form with another; representation, restoring meaning. Now this anxiety of influence is overcome through a psychic defensive strategy. Now let's get into the essay, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of Human Sciences, Jacques Derrida. So throughout this lecture, I'm trying to give you a very short overview of all these terms and essays. Now, as you all know, Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, critically engages with structuralism. He comments on what the structure is and engages with the politics of the structure itself, what he terms as the structurality of structure. So he comments on what the structure is and he also engages with the politic of structure itself, and that's why he terms it as structurality of structure. Now here this essay discusses the extent of limits of structuralism and provides the structures but fails to examine the concept of structure itself. So he talks about structures but he fails to examine the concept of structure itself. And Derrida explains that the concept of structure is as old as the concept of episteme but has never been discussed. Now on explaining the structure, he first defines what a sender is. Now according to him, a sender is an organizing principle that allows for limited play. That is, sender gives structure to its structurality. So sender gives the structure to its structurality. It orients, balances and organizes the structure, but at the same time inhibits play and allows a limited discourse to take place within the structure itself. Forthwith, the structure comes, sender becomes boundaries. So sender is an organizing principle that allows for limited play. It gives structure its structurality. It orients, balances and organizes the structure. Another characteristic of sender is that it is the part of the, yet at the same time it is unaffected by the changes taking place in it. Therefore, sender that leads coherence and structurality to the structure, it is at the same time escapes it. So sender is very important. It leads the coherence and gives structurality to a structure. Now, therefore, the paradoxical concept of sender being both inside and outside the structure, the sender that governs the sender escapes its totality at the same time. So, the paradoxical concept means the opposing concept of sender is that it is inside and outside the structure. The sender that governs the sender escapes its totality at the same time. For example, God is the center of human life and dictates law. Yet at the same time, he is not the part of this life. So the concept of God, we believe that God is the power and it is the center of human life. and we believe that we all live by the laws dictated by God. But at the same time, we find that he is not part of this life. He is absent from the play of human life. That is, we don't see the presence of God directly. So at that moment, we feel that he is absent from the play of human life. Derrida then chooses to call the sender as a transcendental signifier. And lastly, he presents that very essence of the sender, that by limiting play, it is mastering anxiety that free play leads to. Okay, this is how he talks about sender. Then next important thing to be noted is examining the history of structures. By examining the history of structures, Derrida elaborates that one sender gets replaced by another. Thus, the factor governing the play too get epistemologically shifted. For example, the sender of human society shifted from God to Renaissance man. So at a given point of the sender of structure cannot be substituted by various permutations, but historically the sender can get replaced. So initially people were believing in God, then the sender of the universe became man, and in the present scenario, nature is the sender of the universe. So this is how we can say about this. That is the history of structure. When you are examining the history of structure, Derrida elaborates that one sender gets replaced by another, and the factor governing the play too gets epistemologically shifted. For example, the sender of human society shifted from God to Renaissance man, so that at given point the sender of the structure cannot be substituted by various permutations, but historically the sender can get replaced. Now, defining the events that leads to disruption of the structure, the concept of rupture is discussed. And this comes about at a point when structurality of structure is examined. And with this examination, the structure gets destroyed. So the concept of rupture or break or gap is important. And thereby comes a state when there is no sender, conclusively no locus. At this moment, with removal of sender, infinite play takes place. Each sign defines itself with respect to another sign, showing that there is no sender, and in this case even transcendental signifier needs to be defined with respect to other signs. So there is no structure and all is then a discourse. Without structure, then everything will turn out to be a discourse. Now there is an important question to be answered by the deconstructionist. And what is that? Where and how does this descendering or this thinking of structurality of structure occur? This is the question raised by people. Now to this the answer comes as follows. There is no particular event or doctrine that caused it, but discusses three names in particular. So where and how does the descendering or this thought process of structurality of structure occur? For that the answer is relying upon three names. One is Nietzschean critique of metaphysics and especially that of being and truth, the concept of being and truth. Then Freudian critique of self-presence, that is self-presence. Then Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics, of ontology, of the determination of being as presence. So these are the three names associated with the concept of where and how does decentering or thinking of structurality of structure occur. Now, as and when these theories rupture the pre-existing sender, they also enter into a unique circle that relates the history of metaphysics and the history of destruction of metaphysics. So everything is concentrated on human being and their lives of being and truth, of self-presence, or the destruction of metaphysics or ontology, or the determination of being as presence. A pertinent point here to be noted is that nowhere in Derrida is Derrida favoring the doing away of structure. So he is not favoring the a rejection of structure. In fact, what he's suggesting is that necessity to keep a structure for discourse to take place. The focus is on an alternate play of not conforming to the entire concept of sign itself. Now he explains this with relation to Saussure's concept of signs, where a sign is composed of signifier and signified. Now signifier is the physical form of sign, signified is the verbal or word used to define the signifier. So on the onset of the idea of not doing away with the sign is maintained. He talks about the reduction of the binary between the signifier and signified. The two ways of doing this is one, the traditional way of submitting to the traditional way of submitting to the arbitrary relation between signified and signifier. So second is to completely be done away with the arbitrary relation between the signifier and signifier. So first is the traditional way of submitting to the arbitrary relation between signified and signifier. Then to completely be done away with this arbitrary relation between the signifier and signifier. That is, there is where the crux of the essay lies. That is, Derrida wishes to focus on a new mode of thinking. He is not trying to limiting within the old one. Now this is where Freud, Heidegger and Nietzsche fall short. For at the very moment they focus on destroying the structure, they are entering into the discourse of the structure itself. He substantiates this concept by using the example of ethnography, where he says the science of ethnography disrupts the idea of Europe as the center, but the moment he renounces it, he is entering into a discourse within the premise of ethnocentricity. Now Derrida goes on to deconstruct Levi-Strauss' idea of binaries. Strauss devises two categories, nature and culture, where anything that is spontaneous is nature, anything that is acquired is culture. So anything which happens spontaneously, that is known as nature. Anything which is acquired is known as culture. So this opposition is dissolved by something called the scandal. To explain this, the idea of incest prohibition is used. Incest prohibition is a universal and every culture has it, and that it seems a natural act, but at the same time each culture governs this in their own way, thereby making the idea specific. For example, legalization of marriage between cousins among the Muslims is acceptable but not among the Hindus. So this is a kind of universal rule. In a contradiction like this, where the scandal be placed in both, so here the idea of binaries is refuted. Now the main point of focus here is that Derrida in the first place is not withering away the structure but finding flaws in it. The structure has to be kept in order to critique it. What structuralism does is to attribute a truth value to a structure, and this is what is shaken by the theory of deconstruction. So then you can discard the structure or use it to find its play. So this is how Derrida talks, and he also calls this method as bricolage, and the person doing that is a bricolier. Borrowing the terminology from the Strauss, the savage mind, bricolier is a person who uses the mean at his disposal in any desired permutation and combination as he wishes to reach the end goal. So bricolier is a person who uses the means at his convenience in any desired permutation and combination in order to reach his desired end goal. Strauss places the binary opposition of bricolier to that of an engineer. An engineer is someone who builds structures that are coherent, stable, have a fixed center and an absolute truth value. The play of deconstruction of binaries by Derrida here is observable. He explains, since every discourse that borrows its ideas from the sides, coherent or not, is a bricolier, and an engineer too creates structure and discourse, limited or not, from within itself. The opposition gets diluted, and engineer then is a myth created by bricolier. Finally, Derrida observes that there are two ways to interpret structure, sign and play. One aims to decipher an absolute truth and avoid play, and the other affirms play. The first way was dominant throughout human history, and the second is only emerging now. Play must supersede the alternatives of presence and absence, and hence there is no need to be concerned with the absence of the center or of the origin. Now, play is possible if we can forego our need for truth. It's possible then to have a philosophy without concepts, without orientation, and without coherence. So, from this essay, what we understand is that Derrida observes that there are two ways to interpret structure, sign, and play. One aims at deciphering an absolute truth and avoid play, and the other is affirming, or it is asserting the play. The first way was dominant throughout human history, and the second is only emerging. So, always plays should supersede the alternatives of presence and absence, and there is no need to be concerned with the absence of the center or of origin. Play is possible if we forego our need for truth, and it is possible to have a philosophy without concepts, without orientation, and without coherence. Now, next we should understand what is free play. Derrida extends Saussures' insight to show that language, word, and signs are meaningful through a network of oppositions that relate signs to each other. Now, a sign is neither constituted by reference to some substantive independent thing, nor by identity to some signified. A sign is constituted by its difference from other signs. So, in language system, the sign is relational and not substantive. There is no extra linguistic world to which language refers to attain meaning, because its meaningfulness is differential and relational. So, a sign is relational and not substantiative. It differs from other signs. A language can be described as a system of function, relations, and differences, not as referential or representation of some other which exists outside language. Now, free play is the disruption of presence. The presence of an element is always a signifying and substitutive reference inscribed in a system of differences and movement of a chain. So, free play means it is the disruption of presence. Now, free play is always an interplay of absence and presence, but if it is to be radically conceived, free play must be conceived before the alternative of presence and absence. So, it's always an interplay of absence and presence. Being must be conceived of as presence or absence beginning with the possibility of free play and not the other way around. Now, what is supplementarity? Derrida explains the possibility of this free play through the concept of supplementarity. He says, this movement of the free play permitted by the absence of the center or origin is the movement of supplementarity. Now, one cannot determine the center, the sign which supplements it, which takes its place in its absence, because this sign adds itself, occurs in addition, over and above, comes as a supplement. So, we cannot determine the center and the sign which supplements it. Okay, and it comes as a supplement by addition, or occurring in addition, over and above the existing sign. Now, supplementarity thus involves infinite substitution of the center, which is an absence that leads to the movement of play. So, supplementarity involves infinite substitutions of the center, and it is an absence that leads to the movement of play, and this becomes possible because of the lack in the signified. So, a supplement would be an addition to what the signified already means. So, supplement means it's like an addition to what the signified already means. Derrida also introduces the notion of how this meaning is always differed and how the signifier and signified are interchangeable in a complex network of free play. Now, Derrida discusses Lévi-Strauss' use of ration supplementary in his text. Derrida elaborates the notion of supplement in Anthropology, in which he discusses the works of the French novelist and philosopher Rousseau. Derrida points out Rousseau's use of the term supplement in relation to writing. Derrida points out that both Lévi-Strauss and Rousseau employ the term supplement to mean that which adds to or enriches something. Now, to Derrida, supplement in French has a different connotation, and this second interpretation better describes the nature of signification, that is, the relation between signified and signified. Derrida defines supplement as something which is added on as further enrichment, and also that which makes up for something that is missing. So, according to Derrida, supplement means something which is added as a further enrichment, and also something that which makes up for something that is missing. Next is aphoria. The word aphoria originally came from Greek, which meant a philosophical puzzle or a state of being in puzzle, and a rhetorically useful expression of doubt. Now, in contemporary theoretical parlance, the term has more association with deconstructive criticism, especially with the Derridian theory of deference as a reaction of structuralist interpretation of text, which denotes a point of undecidability which locates the site at which the text most obviously undermines its own structure, dismantle, or deconstruct itself. So, aphoria suggests an impasse, a spot, a black spot, or a gap, a note or an inherent contradiction found in any text, and an insuperable deadlock or double bind of incompatible or contradictory meaning which are undecidable. So Derrida, for instance, cites the inherent contradiction at work in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's use of the words culture and nature by demonstrating that Rousseau's sense of the self's innocent in nature is already corrupted by the concept of culture and existence, and vice versa. So Derrida has also described the paradoxes that afflict notions like giving, hospitality, forgiving, and mourning. He argues that the condition of their possibility is also, and at once, the condition of their impossibility. So this is all about aphoria. Many of the aphorias revealed by Derrida were in fact encountered as such long ago by the neo-Hegelian philosophers in connecting phenomena to their various absolutes. All texts undo or dismantle the philosophical system to which they adhered by revealing their paradoxical nature. They subvert all sorts of determined readings, and the clash between the referential or literal and the rhetorical or figurative levels of discourse inevitably results in aphoria, that is, a gap or a black spot. In other words, the gap or lacuna between what a text means to say and what it is constrained to mean creates aphoria. To some critics, the concept of aphoria corresponds to William Emerson's 7 types of verbal difficulty in literature, which occurs when there is an irreconcilable conflict of meaning within the text. So, aphoria means, in short, it is the gap or lacuna between what a text means to say and what it is constrained to mean creates aphoria. So, with that, we come to the end of the 2 modules, that is module 1, which is based on structuralism, module 2, which is based on post-structuralism and deconstruction. With that, we come to the end of this session. In the next session, we will continue with psychoanalysis, feminism, etc. Thank you so much and have a nice day.